Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Wrap. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, today joined by Mr. Hermann Pretorius. And we are certainly feeling the end of the year vibes today, and so is South Africa. We're not going to get too much into this story. I wouldn't call it our first story, but South Africa has discovered that the first of next year's G20 meetings it has not been invited to. The next meeting of the G20 is taking place in the US on, I think, the 15th of December. And South Africa found out from one of the other participants who was invited that we have not received our invitation. This makes me feel a little bit like this is I get the feeling of like a girl being excluded from a high school party and then finding out from her friend that she hasn't been invited to the big party. It's kind of got that vibe to it. And the reason we're not going to talk about it is just because I don't think we really have much to say on this. We've talked this G20 stuff to death at this point. But Herman, anything to say before we move on to the other stories?
Not really in the sense, but except that not being involved in the G20 might actually be good for the ANC because they really have become the party that can only host talk shops and can only
Yeah.
talk. So if the national dialogue was a failure, and the international dialogue certainly didn't give them a bounce and support, I don't think any further exposure to the talking game would necessarily be of benefit to them. So perhaps this is their saving grace.
Yes, indeed. I'm pretty sure that no one seems to know what is actually going on with the national dialogue yet. I see that the ward and sector leg of the national dialogue is still on the website to be confirmed, which is always a good sign. All right, let's get into our first story of today, and we're going to be speaking about Parliament actually flexing some muscles. I know it's been so long in South Africa since this has happened that I think we're not sort of used to it. But the National Assembly has, with the agreement of all the parties except one, approved creating a committee to oversee the presidency. So up till now, the president has been able to effectively avoid a lot of parliamentary oversight of his office specifically, and in particular these ministers in the presidency, which have become a feature of cabinets of the last couple of years. The committee will scrutinize the presidency's budget, and it will seek to hold the president and officials to account. The presidency's budget will be scrutinized. Director General of the presidency has to come and account to Parliament. The president and deputy president can account once per year on key policy matters, and any matter that gets referred to it by the Speaker of the National Assembly or through a resolution of Parliament relating to the president or the presidency can be investigated by this committee. Pretty good thing, I think, all round, and everyone voted for it except MK, which is rather amusing. Herman, am I right to see this as a positive development?
Yeah, I think so. And sort of it, I have to give kudos to MK for having at least internal ideological consistencies. They don't like Parliament in the first place, and yet they want parliamentary sovereignty. So one does wonder exactly how they're going to square that circle, but at least this coheres with their general dislike of Parliament. And well done to them to finding something in this to oppose. But I must say, I think it is a positive development, and it is one of it's something that you and I have spoken about before. It's sort of one of those unintended consequences of the GNU, in that it has shifted, if not the substance of politics, at least the performative theater of politics, and then quite often it's difficult to tell the difference. So if we think back to 2023, when Glynis Breitenbach was really cross-examining the G4S officials involved in the Thabo Bester escape, I remember observing that sort of viral moment, that breakthrough performance, and reading the comments. I don't like the DA, but this lady is what South Africa needs. That sort of sentiment. So I think in South Africa with Parliament, with the GNU, the next sort of phase of proper understanding of the mechanics of Parliament will be for members of Parliament to appreciate the soapboxes of the committees. And that could really be a healthy development where parties can send their talented reps to test their muscle and their merit and their mettle. So generally, I just think it is a good insertion of another sort of platform of disagreement, of accountability, but mainly probably political theatre. But I think that's useful because there has to be a performative sense to the symbolism of holding someone to account. Otherwise, Parliament could simply be reduced to a WhatsApp group or a bunch of emails. So leaning into that, I think, give people a platform to hold the presidency to account and have parties like the IFP, like the ANC, EFF, MK, DA appreciate that these committees can really become potent mechanisms, not just of oversight, but scoring some political points. So, let a million blossoms bloom.
So I think an interesting question is, why do we think the ANC agreed to this? It seems to me that this was, I mean, firstly, the committee is almost certainly going to have an ANC chairperson, right? So it's probably going to, at least in that sense, still be kind of favorable towards the party and protect the presidency. But it also seems like they have recognized, at least on some issues like this one, that there's no point in spending the political capital on having a struggle here. Like it's gonna happen. There's no good argument why it shouldn't happen. And so you might as well just sort of roll with it and save your powder for a much more important battle.
So I would say if we're going to be constitutional purists, there is a reason for this not to happen, in the sense that the president isn't a member of the executive. He is the executive. He is the person elected from, or she is elected from the National Assembly to embody the executive, and then it is the president's prerogative to appoint a cabinet. Well, not the president's prerogative to appoint a cabinet. They must appoint a cabinet, but the power very deliberately flows through their majority gained in the National Assembly. So one could make the technical constitutional argument that the accountability mechanism for the presidency is a motion of no confidence either in the president themselves or in the cabinet of the president. So, there's a very, very niche argument if you're going to be a constitutional purist. But, I'm a relative constitutional purist, and even I don't buy that argument. But I do think that there is, as always with the ANC, there's also a sinister consideration that this committee might be a weapon to get rid of future ANC presidents or current ANC presidents. Because what people should appreciate is that the ANC deputy president traditionally is the leader of the ANC caucus in Parliament, the sort of leader for government business, effectively the prime minister of representing the government in Parliament. So it isn't, I don't know this by any stretch of the imagination as a fact, but it is entirely possible that Mashatile, being the deputy president of the ANC, being the deputy president of the country, has a stronger hold over the parliamentary caucus than President Ramaphosa, and that the appointment to that committee will be made by largely pro-Mashatile forces or Mashatile himself, and that this might be a very useful platform to actually start pre-sabotaging, as it were, President Ramaphosa for a neat little vacancy for Mashatile to step in there. So despite the, I think, objective case of accountability, there's, as ever with the ANC, the consideration of factional politics.
Now, that's a very interesting take. And it sort of makes me think about this kind of thought I've had for a while. So I'm not any sort of constitutional expert, so please inform me if I'm being very off base here. But our system is not, we're not sort of a purely parliamentary system, even though that's kind of how we're designed. It's kind of weird that we elect this president who is more powerful, I think, in some ways, or more independent of the legislature than your average prime minister is, and yet at the same time he's like elected from parliament. not directly by the people, which is this kind of sort of bizarre hybrid of a presidential and parliamentary system. And I've always thought that, I think no one really paid attention to this distinction because we've had one-party dominance since this system was sort of implemented, right? Because I think this is from the P.W. Botha's reforms. I think that the system kind of begins, and then is when our new constitution comes in, it's sort of built upon. But I feel like this is going to at some point cause some problems. I think we kind of need to either be a presidential system or a parliamentary system. And there have been some calls. I know Thabo Mbeki recently said that the system for electing presidents is not correct. He said that when I was chosen to become president, Parliament didn't ask me a single question about my competence for the job. Now, I have no idea what he has in mind. It almost seemed from some of his remarks that he had in mind some kind of technocratic committee. Others have suggested direct election of the president by the population of South Africa. Any thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, so I think our system is actually decently designed, and let me qualify that. So yes, you're right. We are between a parliamentary and a presidential system, where the president receives a unique mandate and a mandate to do stuff, but at the will of the parliament. So it isn't that, like in America or in France, you can be president, or in Argentina, you can be president with a mandate of your own, and that you're in the legislature. But yet you have a mandate. So that means you, in a prime ministerial system or in a parliamentary system with a prime minister, you deal with essentially majority government. That's why we've had majority government. So it's not really a problem, because the prime minister is the person that could at any given point convince a majority of parliament to support them in, a motion of confidence, at least in theory, were that to happen. Now, why it is important that South Africa doesn't have a straight prime ministerial system is because we have a proportional system, meaning that absolute majorities are actually quite unusual, that we should have a system where you have to cobble together a majority in parliament. If you then have
right,
a situation...
I mean, it's possible. It's possible that no party will ever get a 50% majority in our parliament ever again.
Exactly. And if you then have a situation where the leader of the executive is a prime minister that needs a constant majority in parliament or their position is threatened, then you are instilling the sort of instability that our system and our presidency was designed to achieve. Now, many people have said that, the presidency in South Africa was designed for Mandela, and that is why it is such an overly powerful presidency. I actually disagree. I think if you are going to build a proportional system like ours, you need to make sure that the absence of a majority or a likely majority in parliament is somehow compensated for by an executive that can act with relative stability and power, because our constitutional system requires what one could consider occasional majorities. You need a majority to become elected president, and you need a majority to essentially pass a budget. For the rest of the time, you don't really need a majority. So our system, being proportional, with those majorities now, from now onwards, being subject to negotiations within Parliament, we don't want a situation where the executive is paralyzed or held hostage by a constantly negotiating Parliament. So it does make sense to my mind that our presidency is powerful enough to operate once it has that mandate. And if that mandate is being abused, that the parliament has the freedom to act and revoke it entirely. Right. But as you say,
we avoid the situation that, like, the Netherlands or Belgium have often been in recent years, where you have these...
Theresa May.
Yeah, or where you have governments that just don't get formed, and
Yes.
they sort of get stuck in negotiations for what was Belgium's record? It was like over a year where they didn't have a
Yes,
government
yeah, I
because they
think it
just
was
couldn't
16
cobble together
months.
anything. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So I think our framers actually did a quite decent job by creating an executive powerful enough, but making sure that it plugs into a proportional system. Now, you're quite right in pointing out that we haven't seen it function in that way before because we've had an absolute majority that makes the whole thing sort of it defeats the purpose because you didn't need this very powerful presidency because the presidency always went with this very strong ANC majority. But now the president has, at least constitutionally, no guarantee of a permanent majority. So in that
Yes.
sense, adding this mechanism of accountability is, I think, wise. But we shouldn't be surprised if this committee in future becomes incredibly important, like the SCOPA committee on the Public Accounts Committee was for the arms deal, because it is going to, in a sense, be the smaller theatre within the larger theatre. This is the committee that the president's fiercest opponents, either within his party or her party, or on the outside of their party, will seek to control and use as a political cudgel to beat the union building occupant with. But all in all, as I say, let a million blossoms bloom. Let's make sure that tough questions need to be answered. And I hope the parties appreciate that this is a new platform for virality. Use this to break through the sound barrier and make your point more effectively to the public. So yeah, let a thousand blossoms bloom.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that, and I think you've very sold it very well as to what's good about ours. I always get the impression of our constitution that it is this. It creates sort of all these institutions and committees, and this commission to look over this, and this commission to look over that, and auditor general to look into this, and we haven't actually really seen the full potential, I think, of the good stuff in our constitution because we've had this dominance. But a more competitive
Absolutely.
politics might very much open up. You can imagine a situation where you have all these different competing institutions with each other, with appointees occasionally from different parties, because this one was appointed by this president, this one was appointed by a different party's president. And that could make South Africa's democracy quite robust indeed in the future, yes. I think, with a lot of platforms to express views on things. And that's something that as South Africans, I think we have to be proud of.
Yeah, no, agreed. And it is exactly in this era when we realize our constitution was actually designed for non-majoritarian politics. And I'm glad we're there, and we're going to learn a hell of a lot over the coming 2-3 democratic terms as to how these things function. And every time there will be a bit of a shock. Oh, this is something new. But I think we will come to realize that the Constitution is actually, in many ways, a very decently designed document as far as statecraft goes.
Yeah, no, this was one of, I think, it remains one of the underlying truths of South Africa is it's not just that we have this moderate majority as we've found in our polling, is that we do have this good constitutional structure. And everyone from every different ideology can quibble about this. People on the left will say, oh, we don't like the property rights protection. People more on the right say, oh, we don't like all the rights to housing and water, etc., etc. But fundamentally, it is a pretty good document, and I think that it's a strong direction to trim our sails towards, which is why we're lucky to have it. Okay, let's talk about our next story. There's been some economic good news, some indications that things are picking up a bit. Things are still not great out there, though. The ABSA group does this twice a year survey where they ask small businesses sort of how are you feeling, how are you doing, and 38% of the respondents in the latest survey said their enterprise would make it through the next 12 months. without financial assistance, while 40% said that they thought that without external help, they may not survive the next 12 months. This is very similar to what was found in the first half of the year, showing that small businesses in South Africa at least do not feel much of this, supposed sort of economic turnaround that we might be experiencing right now. More than 40% remain in distress or experience strain, according to the survey. This is a survey of 2,134 small businesses defined as fewer than 50 employees. These are very important for employment in South Africa, and they are something that South Africa has not really had a really good time at developing. Hermann, what's your take on this?
So I actually have two sort of slightly contrasting views, but I do think they cohere, but they do contrast in a way. Is number one, this just goes to show again the centrality of economic growth. And if we sort of sum up what economic growth means in reality, it is consumers with money to spend. That is how you know you've got a functioning economy. A growing economy means your consumers have money to spend, and you grow your number of consumers, and you grow the number of or the spending that they can execute. So we genuinely can't be satisfied with point something economic growth. It is a positive thing that we have, that the economy over the last year, the GNU year, does seem to be in a better state than the pre-GNU year, but that's really a limited celebratory measure. The GNU has some successes, I think, particularly on the fiscal side of things. But if we don't get economic growth going, if we don't empower our consumers, if we don't make it easier for people to become consumers and to consume stuff, then our economy can have the best sentiment in the world. It won't change the fundamentals of our situation. And these SMEs, they need consumers. That is why the VAT debate of earlier this year was actually very important. If that VAT hike had gone ahead, this wouldn't have been 4 in 10, this would have been 6 in 10, because it would have been poorer consumers. And poorer consumers simply means you have weaker businesses. So that's point number one, is we can't get away from the fact that economic growth is the key to unlocking South Africa's potential, job creation, the creation of social welfare, whatever the case may be. If we don't get economic growth and we get to it deliberately and aggressively, we're screwed. The other thing I do want to point out is that I've engaged with quite a few on quite a few platforms with various businesses and business representing entities and so on. And one of the things that I do find puzzling and slightly alarming is that South African businesses have not properly come to the realization that certainty is an illusion in the business world. And I think the shocks of geopolitics, and the Trump tariff, trade wars, and all those things have brought to the fore the fact that if you're going to be a business person in South Africa, an entrepreneur, you cannot rely on certainty, because that would be like best case scenario planning. If all things go well, my business will be. And I'm not saying people do that, but I do think that there's a hesitancy amongst businesses to appreciate that just because there ought to be a conducive economy doesn't mean you can only plan for it to have a healthy, conducive environmental, economic sort of context for you to operate in. I'm sitting here in my office. I've got burglar bars on my window. Why? Because I've got stuff in my house that I want to make sure I keep. and other people can't break in. Now, I don't want people to break into my house. I think it's disgraceful that people might break into my house. But I still take the necessary measures to have sensors around my house, in my house, burglar bars, a palisade fence, and dogs to make sure that despite the fact that I really want the stuff in my house to be safe, I must be aware of the fact that it might not be so, and that I need to take steps to ensure that my interests are protected. And businesses should consider running a business in a similar way. If you want to be a business person in South Africa or anywhere in the world, frankly, what's your equivalent of the burglar bars? Have you considered what threats there are to your business in terms of policy or weak economy? Have you made sure that you've got solutions to deal with that? In all facets of life, or in so many facets of life, we are so pragmatic in terms of this is what we want, but we will make sure that we've got peripheral buttressing of our objective so that at the end of the day, we can achieve what we want to achieve. And yet, so often from engaging with businesses, I get this idea that it really is the line between success and failure for businesses are often so thin, because the idea of buttressing your business and making sure that whatever happens, you've got something to sell, you've got consumers to reach, that hasn't really ingrained itself in business thinking. Is that it's almost that we're doing business on the assumption that we are going to get the favorable conditions we need to make a success. So for the 4 in 10 businesses making this point that they can't last the year, now this is of course very easy to say, but part of that entrepreneurial spirit that made America the greatest economy in the world was its inbuilt ability to deal with antagonistic changes, with competition from other states, from other businesses. So I would urge not just to think running a business is appreciating managing it, but looking broad and think, what can I do to influence policy? Should I be supporting the IRR? How can I work with the IRR or the Staatliche or with the Tom Mbeki Foundation or the de Klerk Foundation, whoever the case may be? But businesses need to accept that either they become entirely rule takers of the circumstances, or they appreciate that they can actually influence rules and take the necessary measures like putting up burglar bars, early warning systems, going beyond just hoping that what you want to be secure is secure, and investing more laterally in making sure that as a business, you don't count on good times to operate.
And changing the rules doesn't mean, it can mean, but it shouldn't mean bribing politicians to change the regulations in your favor. It can mean influencing the public debate by being honest about what things will mean for your business. I mean, this is much more a problem with big business than small business, but you'll have this really irritating phenomenon where you'll have business people who will sit around and just complain about like all the policies and the environment and all that. But then in public, we'll go, we're so enthusiastic about the government's new business initiative here. And you're just like, guys, just be honest.
Yes.
I know you're afraid of retaliation, but just be honest. It's going to do you more good in the long term.
Absolutely. And we deal with that so regularly where we hear someone speak to us in private, BE is killing us. And then when they're given the opportunity to speak out about it in public, they just don't. And it is that rule-taking mindset that I think could be broken into understanding that consumers and businesses have political leverage to say, but this policy isn't working. If we want economic growth, Mr. President, sir, change this policy.
And when it comes to uncertainty, I mean, we're looking at the next 5 years, I think, are going to be quite uncertain.
Yep.
2027, we might have an invasion of Taiwan. And if there's a war in the Pacific, let me tell you that the COVID stuff was probably going to look like a cakewalk compared to the chaos that erupts from that. Then, we have the fact that before 2029, we might have a MK, EFF, ANC coalition government, for all we know. That's not going to be great for certainty either. So, I think
hope isn't a strategy.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about our last story. in 2023, the Department of Public Service and Administration decided it was going to launch lifestyle audits. This is a constant demand of government. There's so much corruption that there was pressure to start looking into, are officials who are earning relatively modest salaries living with extravagant means because they're taking bribes. However, at a recent public media briefing, the Minister of Public Service and Administration said that, actually, we've realized that apparently after 2 years, we have no investigative capacity and so actually can't do lifestyle audits. We are thinking about ways to fix this. The plans currently are either to hire the special investigating unit, which has done some good work, for example, on the Tembisa hospital corruption, but they charge money to cover their costs, and it's not clear if that's available at the moment or that's the best use of the money. And so the department is also looking at putting together a, quote, pool of highly skilled investigators to roll out the lifestyle audits that they think could be used by other government departments to investigate stuff. Okay. And on one hand, I'm glad people are being honest and saying this and thinking of solutions. But this was launched in 2023.
Yes.
2025, almost 2026, we find out it can't be done. Yep. It can't be done at all. What? Huh?
And it is rather remarkable that it took 2 years to come to the conclusion that the capacity for the plan isn't actually available. That I think is the most wonderful thing about this whole story is we're going to do lifestyle audits, folks, and then 2 years later, but we can't. Now, the second thing that annoys me about this story is this idea that lifestyle audits are useful. Now, I get it. I think that they are the low-hanging fruit of sort of accountability. If you can see someone driving in a car that they shouldn't be able to afford, you've got an indication of criminality. But this would be like countless little commissions of inquiry. Because just like a commission of inquiry can't make, to my understanding, binding recommendations on prosecutions, then my word, they certainly haven't been doing this in the last 20 years. But also, let's say we find someone is living beyond their means. What then? Are they going to be prosecuted? Well, not with this National Prosecuting Authority.
That seems to be the big flaw in this, isn't it? It's that, we keep finding through these commissions who needs to be looked at, who needs to be investigated, and sometimes just straight up who should probably be on trial right now. And then,
And so the problem with lifestyle audits, it's really just small commissions of inquiry that have no binding consequences, that can sort of find symptoms of a problem, but not actually do anything about it. And this is why I've increasingly come to the conclusion that South Africa has a fundamentally pointless and futile anti-corruption attitude. We see corruption as a thing that bad people do because they are bad, rather than a thing that bad people do because fundamental policies and systems allow them to. The idea of personal gain is as deeply ingrained in the human psyche probably as breathing. So if we are going to have structures and policies that gatekeep, that allocate massive resources, that bakes discretion into the system, that has bureaucracy for the sake of bureaucracy, not for the sake of record keeping and accountability, and sort of making sure that decisions filter upwards based on complexity and the resources needed from superior hierarchies of decision making. As long as we don't realize that these are the driving forces that either create a permissive or a disincentivizing corruption state of affairs, it really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. We could have the best lifestyle audits in the world. It will mean blue bugger all, because as you say, we might just be a bit richer in information of where the problem is, but we're no closer to actually having the sword of Damocles swing and decapitate a few people.
Yeah, unfortunately, shame is in is in very short supply in South Africa, particularly amongst
Historically.
many of the yes, and with shame is kind of the weapon here. Is that simply being found to be pretty likely guilty of corruption can cause some change in behavior, but that's the idea at least. And I think we're long past that point where that is at all a motivating factor, unfortunately. And it's a little bit like the Municipal Financial Management Act, which has all of these requirements for how municipalities are supposed to spend their money. And you must have this as the bidding process, and you must have this, and then these are the requirements for, and then the rules just get ignored by the people who are corrupt. They're not found, they're not prosecuted for it. And those who are trying to follow the rules then have to do this huge pile of paperwork. It's going to be the same here. It's you work for the government, you're actually an honest government employee just trying to do their job, and now you have to fill out this really irritating set of forms, going through every little detail of your life, while you know that nothing is going to come from it. It's completely, it's confusing, sort of simply having the procedure as being like almost the end goal.
And bureaucracy and these sorts of systems can be useful in the sense that not all decisions deserve the same level of attention. Some decision processes are mundane and can be repeated at relatively simple levels. So
if people were getting fired or being prosecuted for the information we found here, it would be very useful.
Yes, but the problem with how our state is structured is that we seem to be hoping, it's the hope strategy. We seem to be we have a very permissive statecraft structure where policies allow for corruption, they create the leeway for corruption, and the best thing we can do is hope that better people occupy positions that, if occupied by psychopaths, can lead to corruption. And I'm afraid that is just not, I think, a good understanding of how the human psyche works. As a rule, if people can benefit from manipulating a system, they will. So don't have systems dependent on having goody two-shoes be the only possible driver of a healthy vehicle.
That's a really fundamental point, and I think this is an important thing about why we have things like constitutional safeguards, and this is the fundamental understanding, is that there will always be at least a couple bad eggs, even in a pretty good, healthy, democratic society where rights are respected. There are still going to be bad eggs who get into the system, and if your system becomes irrevocably broken because you have people of low character in it, then your system is not going to work in the long run. It is inevitably going to break down and fall apart. And so, that's why you need to actually look at the sort of structural things that enable this stuff.
And the last point from my side, people must, something that people quite often forget about corruption is corruption. The definition of corruption, the base definition of corruption, is Transparency International's definition, where it is the abuse of an entrusted mandate for private gain. Note that the word illegal or criminal doesn't feature. Corruption isn't per definition illegal. It isn't a crime to be corrupt. You can be corrupt in a perfectly legal way. So if we are going to pretend that legality and prosecution is the way to get us through corruption, and using commissions of inquiry and lifestyle audits, we are assuming that the law and illegal consequences are watertight enough to deal with corruption, which is a bad assumption, because corruption simply isn't innately illegal. You could have completely legal corruption. That is the problem. If you're going to have a system that allows that, you are going to get that. So yeah, lifestyle audits, fine, do it, but But please, let's like the Scorpions, let's not make it the next idol of getting rid of government corruption. Government corruption isn't something that you manage on the output side. It's something that you disincentivize on the input side.
So I've at times on the show ranted about silver bullets in politics, and I always think that this is a huge problem. And it reminds me of the joke about how do you eat an elephant? Well, one bite at a time. And I think that's really the approach that citizens and politicians should have when trying to actually fix South Africa is how do you fix South Africa? Well, one problem at a time.
Yeah.
And anyway, okay, let's call it to a close there. Thank you very much for listening. We hope you found the show interesting. We will, of course, be back tomorrow on the show. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Cheers, everyone. One last thing. We are recording, as I said earlier in the week, a special on Monday from live 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock on YouTube. We'll go up shortly after that in the audio-only broadcast for those listening on audio-only. Do join us for that. It's going to be our last sort of regular episode of the year. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day. The Daily Friend Show and The Daily Friend are a project of the Institute of Race Relations, the IRR. The IRR is a think tank which was founded in 1929 to study race relations in South Africa and works to change government policy to improve race relations through non-racialism and to ensure the prosperity of all South Africans. If you like our work and would like to support us, please go to irr.org.za and click Support the IRR. Or you can go to thedailyfriend.co.za and click the Fund Us button.